Hi, this is Roger. Thanks for dropping by and welcome to part 2 of the second round of the Project Orchids updates. These are the Dendrobiums. Now obviously with 50 Dendrobiums, even trying to do an update on those would be ridiculous. So these were the ones that were selected for various reasons. One was by popular demand, and yeah, these were all filmed last time about the third week in February. So coming out of winter, but just about only just. So we'll see how they're doing now as we head well into May. So this is the first one, Dendrobium alexandrae. When we filmed it last time it was in bloom. I've done a close-up pop-up of the bloom because this is quite spectacular, this one. Out of my Latoria types it's probably the most unusual bloom. This was in desperate need of a repot last time, but I didn't want to disturb it in what effectively was winter time when it wasn't really growing or doing anything, quite honestly. It was just sitting there, allowing me to enjoy those two lovely blooms. Only two. And at that point this was its first bloom, so first time bloomer at this stage back in February. I was pleased to see the blooms and quite amazed actually to see them in real life. They are quite stunning, but in desperate need of a repot at this point. It had been kept far too wet in the winter, and with the cool temperatures I'm sure that didn't do the root system any good at all. So let's have a look and see what it looks like now. Okay, this one was in bloom last time we saw it, obviously, and now it isn't. Blooms lasted well though. They came out beginning of January-ish and finished right at the end of March, so they lasted very well. So it did well, but Latoria type, and like most of my Latoria types, they suffered in the heat the year before, and that was followed on by them being too wet during the winter. Basically their pots had a fair bit of moss in them. I don't think that's the best way to keep them in my environment, simply because I get those really low temperatures in the winter, which the Latorias don't actually like, but they'll put up with it if they can be kept quite dry. And obviously with a fair bit of moss in the bark and the low temperatures, they were staying wet too long, so there was a fair bit of root loss on this. It's now been repotted. It's just in bark this time round, so I can keep a better eye on it on this one. A lot of the others got mounted actually, but this one's staying in its pot. It's in a clay pot at the moment because it won't stand up. It's a very tall plant and it wobbles, so with the clay pot it sort of stays upright. Now at the moment I've got no new growth showing at all at the base and no sign of new roots. This was the last attempt at putting a new growth up. That was a very long time ago and it failed, so that was probably around the bad times during last year. But nonetheless this one's kept most of its leaves, and it still looks like a reasonably healthy version of this plant. The canes aren't too desiccated or anything like that, so I'm just waiting to see some growth on this one. Soon, I hope. Now, the loddigesii obviously had a winter rest, at which point it dropped quite a few of its leaves. Again, pop-up of the blooms, because in these project updates we missed them. They came in the gap. Nonetheless, at this stage, just coming out of its winter rest effectively, it was just showing signs of some nubbins, but literally only just, to such an extent that you can't really see them in this still. They were tiny, but I was aware that there were some just about starting, which given the previous year was about the same time. So you know, I knew to start looking around this point, but still effectively being rested at this point because those nubbins hadn't started into growth yet, and I don't start increasing the water until there's something to actually water, if you know what I mean. There's no point in feeding and watering a plant that is in effect totally dormant. It's sitting there doing absolutely nothing at this time of year, but just a glimpse of those nubbins about to start. And I was looking forward to a reasonable blooming. Some blooms are better than no blooms, even if it doesn't end up being spectacular. Now this one, the blooms got completely missed in between the updates. I mean, they were filmed, but nonetheless they got completely missed this time round. When we looked at this last time, it had nubbins just starting, so I had signs of buds coming. They grew on. We had a reasonable blooming on it, and at this stage of the game it's doing growths. Now many of these are Keikis, but it's its nature. This isn't a big deal for this one. It often grows like on a rounded branch covered in moss or something like that. It can even be found on the ground. But its normal pattern would be to be growing more like that. And obviously, as these arch, these can touch base, and then the roots actually get into something and form proper new plants. So if anything went wrong with the original plant, there'd be lots of little plants all round. So this can move quite rapidly from where its original plant was, you know, where it first took root. Stand up, you nuisance. There we go. But what we've got here is we've got some good strong new growths coming out from the base, yeah? Some coming from the base of joints on canes, that would be where Keiki's pushed out in the past, and lots of Keikis coming on this. Some of them are going to be close enough to the mount to actually take root. The chances are those will grow into much larger canes than the ones hanging out the end. They're all going to stay on the plant for a while until such time as they've got a good set of open leaves and some reasonable roots, at which point I will take quite a few of them off and there'll be plants to go to others down the line, like I did last time. So anyway, nothing much going on here apart from growth, which is what I would expect at this time of year. It's still dropping some of its older leaves on the oldest canes. Some canes that had leaves on last time we looked are now completely deciduous. They've lost all their leaves, but we've got new growths coming out in many places, so I'm quite pleased. And we'll see how that one progresses through the season. Now this one had to be included by popular demand. I'd have got crucified if I didn't include this. Dendrobium cinelli, Mr. Hairy in fact. It's not a single plant, it's a set of plants basically, and I didn't rest this to any extent because I had new growths coming out at the start of the winter, heading into winter, and I didn't want them to stall. So I made an effort to just keep this one ticking over and allow those new growths to go. Some of the older growths had just about reached maturity, which is right for the plant at that time of year, at the start of winter. But nonetheless, I've kept this growing through the previous winter. Up until this point, I still wasn't increasing watering or feeding on this one back in February. I was still just keeping it ticking over, anticipating the possibility of the odd bloom, but not expecting them because it didn't really get the correct treatment into winter to actually get any form of blooming on this. So I was expecting nothing. Anything would be a bonus, but nonetheless it carried on growing through the winter quite well, slowly but quite well. And this one pushed on reasonably well through the winter, slowly, but I didn't rest this. I had new growths at the start of winter, and if I'd attempted to rest this, not that I'm sure this needs a full winter rest, it just needs cooler, brighter light and not so much water. rather than the full thing. But nonetheless, with new growth, there was no way I was going to stall those new growths. Now some of these have pushed on quite nicely, and I've still got some more new ones coming. So we're not doing well here. At one point I thought, well, I've lost the chance of blooming on this one. There was a possibility of some buds on these old leafless canes, but quite honestly that's where the last lot of blooms came from. So, you know, I just thought, well, maybe from these, but I suspect these are the canes, and so even some of these round here are where it's going to bloom next time round. But what I have just noticed, there's a nub in there, so I think we might be going to get a bud, singular. This plant doesn't really do Keikis to any great extent. It would be a rare occurrence. It tends to just form new canes around the cluster, the base. So we'll see how it progresses, but there might be a chance of a bloom down the line on that cane, because that one's caught between the two. It is losing its leaves, but it hasn't lost them all yet, as opposed to these, which are still fully leaved. These have only just finished growing, these two, whereas this one finished growing a while ago. So we may have a bud, but we'll have to wait and see. This is classed as a difficult thing to grow. I'm not quite sure why, but I've lost one down the way. So this is my new version. It's actually several plants, all mounted together. I didn't know that when I bought it. I thought it was one big plant, but it turned out to be, I think there's 4, maybe 5. I think the tiniest one didn't make it actually, but there's at least 4 individual plants on there growing in various directions. But yeah, I'll just grow this on through the season, you know, get the new growths as large as possible, and any more that come out, push those on as well. And then we'll see about giving this a more pronounced rest this winter. It should be big enough and strong enough to take it this time round. Now I haven't had this one that long. I have actually got it to bloom. The tallest cane towards the left of the shot did actually bloom, and at that point it decided it was the alba form, which was a little annoying, to tell you the truth, because you know, that's not what I thought I'd bought. But nonetheless it got mounted and it pushed on quite nicely. Its latest new growth is dead centre at the top, and that was just opening its leaf about now. It had produced some reasonable roots. It had not a bad root system. A reasonable amount had attached, and a few had gone aerial, sort of pointing towards the front centre. But I was pleased with the fact that it had grabbed hold of the mount and was starting to grow at this point. And looking forward to more new growths and hopefully some more blooms, irrespective of the fact they're not quite the blooms I was expecting. But blooms are blooms at the end of the day, and they were attractive and quite an unusual shape. So this one was just about getting going about this time of year. So let's see what happened next. Now this one's pushing on quite nicely. It's grown a lot of roots. I mean, these roots down here are still actually got growing tips on them, even though they've left the mount behind. But it does have a good root system. Yeah, it's even got some that have gone around the back of the mount. So it's progressed well in the root system. There's a new growth pushed out to the right there. Not full size, but nonetheless. This was a seedling originally. You can see the tiny little seedling canes that have then got bigger and bigger up to the one that's the tallest one there was the one that actually bloomed, and then there's a new one to the right of that with its leaf just opening up at the moment. So it's growing on quite nicely. It's a relatively slow grower for me, but nonetheless it is producing new growths, and with the new growths come even more roots. There's a lot of aerial roots on this one as well. But it seems to be growing nicely. When it's going to bloom again, I really don't know. In theory, if it bloomed on that growth, it ought to bloom on that one. but there's no guarantee. We'll have to wait and see. And it is rumoured that occasionally a spike can resurge. So where a bloom has been, they say if you leave the spike it may shoot out again. But I don't really think this one's going to. Looks pretty dead to me. So we'll have to wait for some new ones, which may be on the latest growths. It may have to produce some more, but we'll have to wait and see. But at least it has actually bloomed once, so at least I know what to expect. And it was a disappointment because it looks like I've got the alba form, which can just happen with seedlings. So you can't blame the person that sold it to me if it hadn't bloomed. They wouldn't know. Yeah, and if you produce hundreds and hundreds of seedlings, an alba form can just pop up in amongst them any time, and it looks like that's what I've got. But I'm going to wait until it blooms again. If it is the alba form, I'll probably let it go to somebody else because it hasn't got the interest for me, and then I'll try and get one that has bloomed that I can guarantee is the actual right form that I thought I'd got in the first place. But we'll have to wait and see. Now the Hibiki, last time we looked at it, had finished its blooms. It bloomed for a hell of a long time, back from the previous year's midsummer right into the autumn. Lots and lots of lovely bloom clusters, so I was well pleased with that. It was mounted upside down, and those upside down canes have made no effort to change their aspect or anything. A few of the leaves have turned upwards towards the light, but they're going to stay hanging down like that. But the set of new growths that were, you know, sort of just getting going here, off to the right near the base of the plant, there's a couple there. There's one tiny one tucked in round behind the canes, but the big strong growth was off to the left at the top of the plant, and that pushed on really well through the winter. The others were a bit slower growing through the winter, but good strong new growths pushing out from the base of the plant. Chances are the next lot of blooms will probably come on those canes that are hanging downwards. They may need to drop their leaves first, but it's a wait and see now, so I haven't had the plant long enough to really get a feel of the way it grows. And this one's getting so big I'm practically sat on the shelves to get far enough away to actually get it in shot. The new growths that we had last time have pushed on, and in the main are still growing. And what I've got now is what I was going to hope were buds, turned out effectively to be even more new growths. So at the moment we're doing lots of new growths, but we do have a problem. This latest growth over here has got a serious problem on the end of its growth. That doesn't feel wet, but it's definitely not right. So I'm actually going to come back here and take that off and seal the end. It doesn't bloom from the apex of the cane, so I'm not losing a blooming area from the cane. If it's going to bloom, it'll bloom back here somewhere. But if this is going to bloom, the most likely place it's going to bloom are on the canes that are hanging down, because these were the original canes on it. So here, 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 and the two behind. The new growths are here. There's one up the back there that was quite young last time we looked, and these two are pushing on nicely. And I've got more coming. Yeah, I've got more what look like new growth. There's even one coming out of the end of a very old cane there. But a little bit of hope, possibly. This old cane here, that's dropped some of its leaves so far, has a nub in. Now that might be buds. It may well be another new growth. We'll have to wait and see. But at the moment I see no real sign of buds anywhere yet. But when this came into bloom last time, it was sort of in the summer, and then it bloomed for absolutely ages right through into the depths of autumn basically. So apart from that hiccup on that new cane, I've got to look into this, because these leaves are not right on this cane. There's something gone wrong here. Now if I didn't know better, that it has an appearance of spider mites. But it's certainly not red spider mite, because they would be there and they're not. But the false spider mites are, generally speaking, without a good magnifying glass, too small to see. So they could be lurking there, you know, doing their invisible thing. So I think I'll give it a spray just in case. But I'm going to take this cane back. So, you know, literally back, well away from any related problem on that cane. The other new growths are fine. Got nice shiny leaves. Yeah, they're okay. It's just that one. Everything else looks okay. Even the older leaves on the oldest canes still look okay. So it's just that one. And I have wondered that where it's positioned, I can just swing round quickly, it lives on that post. And that growth would stick out there to the side. Now in the winter, I had no shade netting on. That one growth could have got direct sun on it. It could have just been that. And it's just taken a while to sort of show through. Anyway, we've got growths, you know, those that are pushing on from last time, and some new ones just starting. So it's doing okay. Be nice to see some blooms on it again, but you know, as and when you're ready. It makes more sense to film it where it lived through the winter, then you can possibly see what you mean. What I mean, this growth here, out to the side, would have been exposed to direct sun through both of those panes of glass, albeit sheltered a little bit possibly by some other plants, whereas these have got their back to that bright light, so wouldn't necessarily have been affected. So that's what I was getting at. It's just literally the position of that one growth sticking out to the left there. And that could have been all it was. But anyway, I've got to deal with it. Yes? What can we do for you? Nosy? What you doing then? He never comes out here, do you? Eh? Don't you get biting the plants? No. He usually just sniffs them. He doesn't take much notice of them. It's just being nosy, basically, aren't you? Aren't you? Eh? You being nosy? You nosy cat. Eh? Nosy cat. Right, back to the orchids. Come on, out from under me feet, cat. Now the Dendrobium aphyllum, again, was just pushing out some nubbins at this time. In fact, my primulinum was the first of the winter resters to bloom, but it was hotly followed by this one, two of the earliest that I've got basically. But starting off with the cane to the left, the Keiki that arrived from Alberto, I then grew one new cane throughout last year, which actually bloomed over virtually the whole length of the new cane. So I was quite pleased, and basically I just getting that one new cane, I was a little surprised I didn't get more, but you know, it had to establish itself last year, grow some roots and sort of get going, because effectively it was just a Keiki, and even the Keiki bloomed. But anyway, we had blooms on this in the gap again. It just happens to be the way the updates go, but the nubbins were just about starting to show on the cane. Most of the leaves had dropped. There was just a couple hanging on at the very end of winter. This is another one where I've got to get back. I can't even get back far enough to get this one in. Now this is another one that we've, in between the updates, this has had a really good blooming. I was well pleased. Arrived with a Keiki that bloomed that spring. Grew on a nice long cane last year, which did a mass blooming basically, almost the full length of the cane. And so last year it grew one new cane, and this year we've got two new growths which are pushing on strongly at the moment. These are pushing out really well. They will eventually get long enough to hang down, or heavy enough and long enough to hang down, but at the moment they're pushing on nicely. So this is one of the classics where feed and water well, basically, because those canes there have got to get at least that long before the end of this growing season, and then we should have 2 canes full of blooms next year. So I can say it's progress. It's gone from a Keiki to growing 1 cane, which bloomed well. This year it's growing 2 canes, which is progress, you know. Yeah. And hopefully the following year it may grow 3 or even 4. As the strength of the plant builds up, the number of new growths should increase. That's just the natural way of these types of dendrobiums. But yeah, 2 nice strong new growths coming on that one. Doing okay. Now, when we last had a look at the Prima Donna, it was just coming into bloom. The first couple of blooms were just starting to open. Quite a lot of buds, you know, still to come. Top left you can see some sort of, they're very close to opening, and then up from the centre up towards the top right, more buds there, and round the back as well. So there were quite a few of the older canes had produced buds, and these buds were filling in gaps on those older canes where it didn't bloom the year before. You can see the stumps of the spikes sticking out from the canes. That's the previous year's blooming. And then all of these buds here are just filling in the gaps. So all of those old canes now have completely finished. They won't bloom again. They've used up every node, or they will do by the time these buds have opened and gone over. So those old canes at that point, once they finish blooming, are merely support for the rest of the plant. Just storage basically, and certainly with the state of this plant as it is now, they can stay. So I'm looking for new growths. The nobly type Prima Donna, we had blooms just opening, so that was back in the 3rd week of March, and loads of buds to come. This one has since bloomed, and I literally took the last 2 blooms off yesterday. So, you know, well into May. So this was in bloom an incredibly long time. It's now been repotted, so I'm looking for new growths on this one. These are last year's 2 canes that, due to its demise, I've got to go careful or this is going to fall over. It has to lean against something, this one, it's very top heavy. They didn't get to full size because it was split and disturbed at the wrong time of the year. But basically I'm looking to the base of the plant now, and there is movement. So down in amongst here somewhere will be some new growth soon, starting with some new roots. So it's coming back into growth. That should push on quite a lot quicker now the last of the blooms have gone. There are quite a few dendrobiums and other types of orchids that seem to be reluctant to grow anything at all while they're in bloom. And then once the blooms have finished, it seems to trigger new growths. Not on all of them, but there's quite a few, I can safely say, are in that sort of set, you know. I mean, some of them are coming into bloom and growing other spikes and pushing up new growths and new roots all at the same time. But it seems to be a bit of a pattern for me. So yeah, what we'll be looking for on this now is new canes, and hopefully growing up to their full size during this season, which will then head this one back to its former glory, because this was a massive, well, it was best hybrid in show last spring. Certainly wasn't this year. But we should be on the way to getting it back to that sort of state by the end of this year. I'd like to see at least 2 new canes. But given its split and its setback, it may only even produce 1. But I would hope for 2. If I get 3 or 4, I'll be over the moon. But yeah, finished blooming now, and the 2 canes that I've got finished growing during last year, they're not going to grow anymore, so I'm looking for new ones to replace them. These 2 canes might even bloom later this year, but otherwise those 2 will bloom next year despite not being full sized. They'll still bloom, and then hopefully the growth that we get this year will also join them. And there might even be a few gaps that haven't bloomed on some of the older canes that may push out next year as well. But we'll have to wait and see. Okay, so that was update 2, part 2, the Dendrobiums, and I would suggest the next set of updates, as we're coming into May now, probably going to be about the beginning of July, sort of mid-season, something like that. But part 3 will follow on during next week, which is the selected Cattleya types and a couple of Tolumnias, and then the last part will follow on from that, which is a selection of cooler growers. It's a bit of a mixture, that one. So anyway, that was update 2, part 2. See you next time.